Hello and welcome to Root Causes, the PKI and Security podcast where a pair of industry veterans talk about all matters digital certificates and PKI. I'm Tim Callan, Chief Experience Officer at Sectigo, and I'm here with Jason Sirocco, Senior Fellow at Sectigo. How you doing today, Jason?
Doing great, Tim, and very excited to have a guest.
Super excited to have a guest, not just any guest. We have Dr. Michele Mosca of the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Michela.
Hello, Tim. Hello, Jason. Great to be here with you guys.
We're happy to have you. We have been talking about you for 5 years, Jason, and
Yes.
only good things. Don't worry, only good things.
Yeah, I was just about to deny it all. Yeah.
I'm excited to be talking to you, with you, instead of just about you. So welcome so much. You've obviously been a big voice in the discussion of quantum computers in general and post-quantum cryptography in particular. And, this is a topic that Jason and I care a lot about.
Yeah, great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
So we are recording this in the late days of 2024. You'll probably be listening to it, listeners, in early 2025. And there was just a very important announcement from Google. So for starters, tell us what that was.
They've told us about some of their latest work that came out actually just a few weeks ago is in this sort of academic scientific domain. Just further, like a really non-trivial advance in quantum error correction.
Right.
And this has been an almost 30-year journey where in 1996, researchers said that if these surely impossible assumptions are met, we could do fault tolerant error correction, right? And to us in academia, that was a big breakthrough because going from impossible to nearly impossible is a big advance. And we knew that, sure, of course, we're going to have to, remove a lot of these assumptions or make them more practical. But again, from impossible to you could do it, with these, because it was like 10 to the minus 6 error rates, and every qubit could interact with every other qubit, and so on. And then years later, the theory improved way beyond my expectations, and nearest neighbor interaction sufficed. And then error rates, started approaching even 1%, like in terms of tolerable error rates. So we've come a long way in the theory as well as the experiments. But the thing with fault tolerance is, if the devices doing the error correction are noisy and the noise is too high, it actually makes things worse, right? Because the way error correcting codes work, even with classical information, like if this channel here is noisy, we would try to fix it by repeating, the same, somehow introducing redundancy. But if our memory's bad and then we're writing things down poorly and we try to error correct, we actually make things worse. And there's a lot of moving parts when you try to implement quantum error correcting codes. And we were improving all the parts, and often they would meet the necessary thresholds and quality criteria, but they have to do that in the same system at the same time, so that when you do the error correction, extract the syndromes in real time and so on, the end game is you get a lower error rate, you get a lower logical error rate than you had a physical error rate. And the theory tells you if you go to a bigger code, the error gets suppressed even lower, right? That's what the theory says. And Google's experiments showed that when they went to a bigger code, they actually had a lower logical error rate than when they had a smaller code or no code at all. So that's just, amazingly beautiful and is really taking us into this near final phase of toward a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, which started with, again, in the early days, it's like, find me a qubit and show me some basic functionality, get me multi-qubit systems, start implementing the building blocks of error correction and so on. And now we're in, as John Preskill called it, the era of quantum error correction. And the next phase is really large scale, logical qubit systems, which among other things will be cryptographically relevant. So it's been a long journey, but it's really come a long way. And this is one of the exciting things. And it's kind of like the 4-minute mile. Like, there's several players now that are making amazing advances here. alongside this Google News. Like just I think yesterday, Physics World gave a prize to Google, and I think Quera, I'm not sure how they pronounce it, who do neutral atoms, a completely different platform, also doing amazing things. And then, of course, you have the Quantinium results and the IBM results, all, super impressively advancing this frontier of quantum error correction.
Michela, before we came on, you had started to describe these 5 stages.
Yeah.
I'd love you to characterize what those 5 are and where we are today.
Yeah, not going from memory, but I've seen these charts, by people like Frank Wilhelm and also our friends at Yale and others have defined different, have cut up the pie or that journey into different, called the stages, drew the lines in different places maybe, but the first stage was just getting a qubit. What physical system will I use to encode my qubit, and demonstrating the qubit functionality, and then the 2-qubit functionality. Right? Of course, error correction needs more than that. You have to be able to initialize and read out, right? And so there's all these building blocks to error correction, which starts to take us sort of into the 3rd phase, and then the 4th phase. You see all these pieces coming together, and then in the 5th phase, you have scalable, implementations of these components that you've just spent, now decades defining and refining and getting into a platform where you can do all these pieces at the same time, scalably. And very importantly, when you make a bigger computer, you have to make sure your error rates don't go up, right? And of course, to do that, or a natural way to do that is to have modular systems, so that once you kind of get each module working and the networking pieces working, then it's a matter of just integrating, well, just in quotes, but and that's many moving parts and many achievements, starting with getting a qubit that kind of works, and 2 qubits that work, and then reducing the error rates and getting all these other functionalities like measurement and feedback. To now, again, we're at the cusp now where we have these architected into platforms where you can do everything in the same system at the same time, fast enough and well enough that you can start entering the scaling era, which will be sort of that final 5th phase where you can start implementing algorithms on logical qubits.
And I would imagine, Michela, that's where Shor's algorithm comes into play, obviously.
Yeah. So if you really want to implement Shor's algorithm on a cryptographically relevant, sized integer, the only way we know how to do that is with quantum error correction. Mm-hmm. And so we're in that era now. Now, the number of logical qubits we have now are still not enough. You could do it on a laptop still, but remember 5-10 years ago, say 10 years ago, a laptop could outperform even the physical qubits we had, right? And now that day has come and gone. We're now at the point where you can't simulate on a laptop or even a supercomputer the current quantum computers at the physical qubit level. We're still looking for useful applications of these sort of limited size quantum computations, but they're already at the point, they've passed the threshold of we can't just simulate it on classical devices, and people are working hard on doing useful things with them. But now we're not switching, but evolving. We still have the physical qubits, we still have NISQ, people are still looking for commercially useful applications, and now we're starting the counter on logical qubits, and we're actually quite soon, like we're talking how many quarters, not how many years or decades, how many quarters before our logical qubit systems can't be simulated by classical computers, right? And then when we enter the era of, and what can they do that's useful, we're not limited to which algorithms are noise tolerant anymore. We can do arbitrarily larger and larger, error corrected quantum computations on these devices. There'll be useful applications before we get to cryptographic relevance, and there'll be useful applications even more beyond computers big enough to break RSA 2048.
Michela, I got to ask you to address a portion of our audience who are practitioners in the commercial world, whether they're implementing cryptographic systems for enterprises and whatnot. These people have heard from the analyst community of a date such as 2029 from Gartner. And also, obviously, we have the NIST deprecation dates for RSA 2048, ECC 256 starting 2030. I don't know if they've heard from where I think the real truth comes from, which is the scientific community, which is where you belong. I would love for you to address that community here.
And specific, because there's a lot of things that I'd love to comment on and help with. You talking about the threat timeline or just the
I
full
am definitely
spectrum of
thinking,
issues?
yeah, I think a very simple terms in terms of how real is it? Because I think there's still some people who are
Yeah,
trying to interpret what it means.
yeah, yeah,
In other words, I think there's a lot of people who think that the NIST deprecation dates are just an arbitrary date that's
yeah,
chosen, and we won't have post quantum till much later than that.
yeah,
Love to hear all of your opinions on this.
yeah, yeah. So first of all, we desperately need these colleagues to keep doing the remarkable, almost thankless work they do. Because the reason, I mean, we see all the bad things that happen in the world, but we know they could be a lot worse. And the reason they're not a lot worse is because of all the great work that security architects and implementers and so on are doing. And my background is actually in classical cryptography. Early 90s, I was trying to break the public key algorithms of the time, back when it was really a niche and a curiosity for most people. And so I've had many mentors and colleagues who've been a part of implementing real world cryptography and deploying it and getting it standardized. And so I understand, I saw from them that this is a hard exercise. There's doing, the theory is hard, the implementation is way harder. And there's so many aspects to it where, we'll from academia we'll come to it and say, oh, why don't you just do it this way? And then, then you get the 10 reasons why you can't just do it that way. There's a lot of real world considerations like, deprecation, and you don't want to lose significant fraction of your customer base, and interoperability and implementation errors and all this real world stuff that we have to be very respectful of. And so what I'm trying to do to be useful to the community, manage, trying to, and really, what are they doing? They're giving us the platform, a safe foundation so we can run, like we can race ahead. Because we couldn't have had the last 30 years of economic growth without public key cryptography, right? And we're going to leverage digital platforms more and more than we ever have. And for all this value creation, like that's the fun part that people like to talk about. But you can't do that if you don't have, all the robust, the guardrails, secure ways to do all these things. So we need that, and we want to enable that. So again, what we're trying to do is frame this risk amongst all the other ones in a way where we don't understate it and we don't overstate it. But the fact is, we don't know when it's going to happen exactly, and we don't know the full extent what else quantum computers can break. So the best we can do is try to honestly portray what we do know, because my practitioner friends for years have been saying, look, if you gave us a timeline, we'd be better positioned to manage this risk alongside all the other risks we have to manage. And the academics would tend to say, well, we can't possibly know, that I'm not going to answer that question. I'm like, look, we don't have to give definite answers, but there's a material difference between unlikely, less than 1 in 1,000 chance unlikely versus 49% unlikely.
Right.
And I think let's start to give a bit of color there, and let's be honest about where we disagree, and let's see where we do agree. So we're trying to give a realistic timeline for when these devices will come, and then organizations will have to take their risk tolerance, right, and match it along, with these risk, these are estimates, right? This is really it's not perfect. It's not super precise, but it's far better than anything else I've seen. And it's really meant as a guide. And back in 1996, my master's thesis committee at Oxford, very cruelly asked me, when do you think we're going to have a quantum computer? And I just started learning about quantum computing, but I did get to meet a lot of the pioneers before that, and some of them have won Nobel Prizes. So I was starting to get an intuition for what the deal was. And I tried not to answer the question, but I eventually did. And I said, look, it's going to be more than 20 years, but in 20 years, we're going to have 20 qubits, and then it'll start to become clear. So, like, translating that into sort of a risk timeline or threat timeline approach, what I was saying is the probability is effectively zero for the next 20 years, and then it kind of sort of starts to crawl up, right? So all the probability mass is 20 years into the future. And of course, if you asked many people, you'd get different distributions, but for most of us, it was some many years in the future. And some people will say, oh, it's always 20 years in the future. Of course, now some of them are saying it's always 10 years into the future. Well, which one is it? Was it always 10 years in the future? Always 20 years in the future? So I think the fact that it went from always 20 years in the future to always 10 is saying there was progress. And I think what's happened is that probability mass went from gradually over the last 5 years plus, from mostly 20 years in the future and beyond, to, I would say there's anywhere between a fifth to a third of that probability mass is in less than 10 years, right? So it went to being negligible in the next 20 years to there's already a third chance or higher in the next 5 to 10 years, which is, given what's at stake, an unacceptably high risk to not have some sort of mitigation plan. So, and I understand why the White House and others are saying, get this done, by 2030. Do we know for sure it's going to happen by 2030? Well, no, but even being one day too late could have catastrophic consequences. And if you look at the precision with which we could possibly, this is not like Y2K where we know the date with perfect precision. Like there's going to be a spectrum of uncertainty here. As time goes on, those the probability mass, the probability distribution starts to become tighter and tighter. Like it becomes earlier, and the variance gets tighter. But it's still, we'd be super lucky to even have a 5-year variance, which we don't have. So, if we get this done in 2030 and cryptanalysis starts in 2032, then we'll have been super lucky, because if it happens in 2032, that means there was a non-negligible chance it could have happened in 2028. So I think they're right on the one hand to be pushing us to have at least our more critical systems ready and have the tools ready by 2030. And yeah, hopefully it doesn't happen. The cryptanalysis doesn't start in 2030, because that would have meant we were playing it way too close.
Right. Well, and that would have meant probably that we played it beyond too close when you consider the harvest and decrypt scenario, right?
Yeah, yeah. Like, oh yeah, that ship sailed. Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things I find interesting in a lot of the conversations about this is people discuss this concept of a date at which we achieve cryptographic relevance as if it is a single date. And this is another way that it's different from Y2K, right? Because there are a variety of different secrets, and they're going to be of different value. They're going to last for different periods of time. And so, when let's say there's one cryptographically relevant quantum computer somewhere in the world, that's going to be used on a very elite set of secrets. When there are 100, it's going to be a much broader set of secrets, and when there are 10,000, it will be broader still.
Yeah.
So I what do you like? I always hear this talk. Well, what date? What is the date? What is the date of cryptographic relevance? And it always strikes me as a funny question, because it seems to me like it shouldn't be a date. It should be a spectrum of time, right? With a concentration in the middle and kind of a fading relevance on either end. What how do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's part of the risk calculation. Indeed. And there's uncertainty as to when that it starts to become possible at all. And then how quickly does it ramp up from that 1 to 100 to 10,000? And some people say, oh, it's clearly going to be, they're using it as an excuse to say, I can wait and see.
Right.
And I think you have to be ready, right? It's one thing to say, I'm gonna kind of wait and see and decide how to turn the knob, right? But you have the solutions, they're deployed, they're certified, they're scalable, and you're kind of deciding, well, when am I gonna, turn it on or deploy it or scale it, versus when am I gonna start thinking about all the real world issues to deploy it. So you have to be ready to act way before we even get to that first phase. Again, for certain not super critical systems, you can wait before switching it on or scaling an existing trustworthy solution. But there's decades of work to get to that point. So that work has to get done. The other thing I would emphasize is it's not necessarily going to be a 10-year gap between the first, where it's a small set in the hands of state actors versus there's many of these things, and just everyday cyber criminals get access. I mean, cybercrime it's not like there's a threat actor who has to own the quantum computer and who's coming after your bank. Like there's going to be, just like we have today, people who sell malware, people who sell DDoS as a service, and all these other things. There's going to be criminal services built out of quantum code breaking capabilities. Most criminals aren't going to go buy private keys. They're going to buy a criminal service that is built on a criminal service that's built out of somebody who can get private keys. Another sort of factor that some people assume is that, well, of course, the first few quantum computers that are commercially available, there's going to be know your client controls, and only nice people doing nice things are going to have access to these quantum computers. That's not how criminals work, right? They're going to certainly bypass those controls. It's just a matter of how hard it is for them. And the harder you make it for criminals to get in, the harder you're making it for legitimate users to get in and use them to create value. So we want strong foundations. So you don't have to. This is just another HPC, high performance computer, not some weapon of mass destruction, or we don't want it to be that, because we want to benefit from quantum computers. So we have to get ahead of it. We want them to stay online and be accessible. Of course, there's going to be export control and stuff, but I mean, cyber actors will get on these platforms by either hacking people who have legitimate access or pretending to be people. I mean, they have the playbooks. We don't have to write them for them, and they'll come up with new ones. So again, that assumption that I often hear, I would think carefully on that, whether it's really, I don't think it's going to really be the case that the bad actors are going to be able to hold them off these commercially available computers. And that's the end game. Like we want to make these commercially available so people want to all be, the Quantum Valley of the world, and we want to create economic prosperity for the world using these platforms. So we don't want to unduly control and slow down their deployment. And another factor is, because people often say, they look at the literature and they say, oh, but it'll take, this massive computer 24 hours or 8 hours to get one key. Like these are just benchmarks. Like in our threat timeline survey, we say 24 hours just to have some benchmark that is not too big, not too small. Because most of my colleagues are not like 24 hours, 2 hours, 1 week. Like this is still, very coarse-grained estimation. So I didn't want to overcomplicate it. So we just picked something meaningful, not too big, not too small. But there's no, like, adversaries, first of all, don't tell you when they've come up with a better algorithm. So, a very, very modest algorithmic advance could shave off a factor of 10 or 100, right, in the real world cost. So I agree with you. This is going to be something that will ramp up, but we don't know the exact start time because adversaries might not tell us. When for the secret quantum computers, we don't know when those are going to be available. And for the publicly known ones, we don't know exactly how fast they'll progress. We don't know the algorithmic advances that will let people get more cryptanalytic power out of a finite, certain size quantum computer. So we do need to be ready. So I think you just have to take this balanced approach of, this guy isn't necessarily going to fall the moment the first quantum computer comes, but don't use that as a reason to delay being ready.
And to your point, you could imagine progress coming really fast, right? Like once certain milestones get hit, you could imagine the productization of it to go extremely quickly, right? Where okay, now that we figured out how to do it, it's quite straightforward to figure out how to do a whole lot of it, right?
Yeah.
And so I agreed with that. One of the things you told an anecdote about, or made a reference to being asked an unfair question by your dissertation board about when we're going to have
Yeah.
quantum computers, which makes me tempted to ask you an unfair question,
Yeah.
which is, what everyone really cares about, right? Is when will cryptographic relevance occur? And this is this hugely debated topic. You study this very closely. In
Yeah.
your mind, if I made you give me an over-under date, what are
Uh,
you gonna pick?
right. Right. And that's, I mean, I like phrasing it
Right,
as a probability, right? And I
right.
like turning it into a betting game. Like, and I have several bets with colleagues around the world, because then we're not talking about our feelings anymore. We're just, what
Yep,
odds are you willing to accept? And
yep,
maybe there should be a betting market so people can hedge. And maybe I'm not going to migrate, but I'm going to buy an insurance policy. But then you have to decide, is that premium really better than just migrating to PQC? So I don't mind it phrased as a probability versus how many jelly beans are in the jar, guess a number. So, because I think it's about 1/3 chance in 10 years.
okay. From
But you
today?
asked for the 50% number, but
Yeah.
I don't know if
One
you'll
third
take
in
the
10
1/3
years, that's
number.
helpful. That
That's
gives
my
us.
personal estimate. And of course, for anything moderately critical, that's obviously not acceptable. And you could factor in, maybe a year or two, depending on which threat actors
Yeah.
you're worried about. But rough order, that means we
Sure,
really,
sure,
really,
right.
really need to be ready in
If
less than 10 years.
if you were gambling with your life, you would not
Yeah.
accept a 1/3 chance, right? You would view that as
Yeah.
many orders of magnitude too high,
Yeah.
right? And you could argue that for a lot of our use cases, that's exactly what we're doing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, maybe
I
a final
agree.
question before I let you go, Michaela, just because I
Yeah.
know you're an expert in the topic, but Tim and I on this podcast often talk about um, threats to RSA that are not about quantum computers.
Yeah.
Just anything you have to say about that is of interest to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this maybe segues into maybe a future podcast comment, the discussion, because there'll be a lot more we could say about all of this. So that's what I was working on before I heard of quantum computers. Of course, when I heard of quantum computers, I dismissed them as nonsense, and then my supervisor at Oxford forced me to talk to the physicists, and I realized they weren't entirely crazy. And so that's when I started working on quantum computing as well, to understand, well, what else can they do? But absolutely, like even more scary than a quantum computer breaking these codes is a laptop, right?
Right.
Or a regular, more available platform that is, more easily accessible and cheaper. And that's what happened with some of the NIST finalists, right? They were broken by a laptop in a matter of hours or days.
Yep.
And that could happen with RSA, and that could happen with Kyber or dilithium. So that is a real risk. Personally, I estimate the risk on a relative scale of ECC being broken up to be about a fifth of RSA being broken in a 10-year period.
Okay.
And then, I put ECC at about a 1% chance. And so RSA about 5x that. So small, but not that small. And honestly, we should have been mitigating that risk all along. Again, not everywhere. Like for most systems, pretty good is good enough. But as you start betting more and more of our lives and economy, and when you were saying you wouldn't bet your life, in some cases we are literally betting lives. Like there are in some cases, it's not just a IT issue, IT security, it's a safety issue. And not to over dramatize, but there are places, especially as various other technologies and health technologies and IoT and so on, it really can become a safety issue. So sometimes it's not just a metaphor. But the economic stakes are just way too high that you would take a 1 to 5% chance, right? And then, again, these are my personal estimates. Some people might put them lower. I don't think there's rationale for making them that much lower. So I think we really should have been ready for this day. And I think that's where this quantum threat, in quotes, is actually a blessing, because this was something we should have been doing anyway. Like the way I sometimes put it is, back in the 90s, we architected for, the cryptographic foundation we architected was good for a 3-story building. We'd been living in bungalows in the 80s, and now we're going to go up to these awesome 3-story buildings. So we built pretty good foundations. We had RSA and Diffie-Hellman, so we had alternatives. We had some diversity. It was all great, but then we built a skyrise, you know, 100-story building, and now we're talking about, you know, much more massive complexes on top of more or less the same foundation. And if it weren't for quantum, we'd still be kind of letting it ride, just hoping for the best. Like, and hope is not a good strategy when the stakes are unacceptably high. So, and I'm not suggesting, oh, well, it's risky, so we shouldn't use it. No, absolutely use it for all the wealth creation it's enabled already and will continue to enable. But let's just build in those guardrails, that defense in depth, the agility, especially for the more critical systems, so that we can sort of confidently continue to leverage everything that digital and, you know, connected technologies will enable.
Yeah, I think you've been dropping things left and right that I think we're going to have to pick up and ask you if you come back to have a future conversation with us. I love this idea of talking about breaking traditional RSA in more depth. I, love this concept you have of quantum computers in a weird way, perhaps being a blessing, and some of the other things you've said. Uh, I'm wondering if this is a good time to put a bow on this particular conversation, and then we'll see if we can talk you into coming back and talking to us some more on another date. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, looking forward to
Excellent.
it.
So thank you so much, Dr. Michele Mosca. Great conversation, and hopefully more to come.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Have a great
Jason.
holiday.
Thank you.
And this has been Root Causes.